I'm lucky this thing works. Yeah, there we are. It's much better. I should have. Okay, this is just a bit of a talk because I know recently the Department of Agriculture published a list of 12 wildlife species that are now registered as animals in terms of the Animal Improvement Act, and that's caused a bit of controversy. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it as well. Some people think it applies to all those species, no matter where they are. So the whole idea of this thing, that's okay, I'll talk into this. Just don't want to fall off the edge here. The whole idea of this is just to bring in a bit of clarity and also to show what advantages there are to this thing. A lot of people don't see the advantages, but there are massive advantages. And the main reason is that there are a lot of wildlife species that have been farmed extensively and intensively on agricultural land. You'll see I mention the word agricultural land. These animals need to be recognized as farm wildlife or game, particularly because wildlife ranching is, to be quite honest, often the most sustainable option in these areas. And so it's important, it's a better alternative to domestic livestock. So the publication of the list as an amended table, that's table 7 of the breeds of animals in terms of the Animal Improvement Act, was seen by many of us as a step in the right direction and a long overdue step in recognising farm wildlife. As I said, while some may question this step, it effectively paves the way towards more effective control of farm wildlife and can also make a meaningful contribution to conservation by generating genetic information that can be used when considering the introduction of farm wildlife genes into endangered populations in conservancies. It also makes assisted reproductive technology refined in the domestic livestock sector more available for use with farmed and conserved wildlife. There is quite a bit of DAFF legislation relevant to wildlife, and so while this will deal mainly with these 12 species, it's useful just to have a look at the legislation that is there. You heard mention of Section 4 of the Constitution previously. A lot of the legislation with agriculture is national legislation, so it applies to all the provinces, and there aren't provincial versions of it, which can be a massive advantage in some cases. Just to have a look at it, the one that some of you might be aware of is the Animals Protection Act and the Performing Animals Protection Act. These things are difficult to apply, and quite often, particularly with the Animals Protection Act, it needs somebody to complain about something before something's done. But a useful aspect of this is that people are starting to ask questions about welfare, and it could be possible to bring in a certification on the welfare status of animals, particularly farm wildlife, which would be very useful then. And in some cases, of course, with the Performing Animals Protection Act, certain wildlife operations need to get that license every year. These are the ones that are more well known: the Abattoir Corporation Act, which would deal more with game meat, the Meat Safety Act as well, and then the Animal Health Act. Most of the animal health activities are at provincial level, and then the Animal Diseases Act, and then the Veterinary and Paraveterinary Professions Act, which also governs the registration of veterinarians and their activities. Then we have the Perishable Products Export Control Act, the Agricultural Products Standard Act. Again, these are mainly deal with meat, and this has been applied in any case and complied with. The Fencing Act has some application, and then the CARA, Conservation Agricultural Resources Act, actually should have a lot of applications, particularly when we're looking at species and that, but it's very difficult to monitor and enforce. It's a pity. But the two that we really look at are the Animal Identification Act and then the Animal Improvement Act, which is the act that now has 12 species. The Animal Identification Act needs for animals to be listed before they can actually come into this act, but it's a useful act to have, and it links to the Animal Improvement Act, so I've put the two together. The implications of this Animal Improvement Act is the important thing, and it currently applies to the 12 species I mentioned, namely black wildebeest, blue duiker, blue wildebeest, bontebok, gemsbok, impala, oribi, red hartebeest, roan, sable, springbok, tsessebe. By definition, as I mentioned, these are now listed in this table 7, and a registering authority has already been established for these breeds. But it's important to note that no other species have been registered as animals in terms of the Act at present, so it only applies to these 12 species. But effectively, the entire Act applies to the 12 species, but again, only to those animals on game farms. I would have preferred it if they'd put it in the table farmed wildlife, but they put in game. But it's important to note that it doesn't mean that if there's an impala in the Kruger Park, it suddenly has a bit of a link to this Act. It doesn't. The number of game farms in the province is just to give you an idea of the extent of this and how much farm wildlife is actually involved. I haven't got numbers on the farm wildlife, but if you look at the bottom there, you're looking at a number of over 5,000 game fenced farms. Look at the total area of that. So you can see what sort of impact it brings. And this is again, remember the term farm wildlife. Just as an example, it's nothing strange to agriculture. All the buffalo farms are registered in terms of animal health legislation. So these are the buffalo farms on the DAFF register at the moment. But again, buffalo isn't a listed breed at this stage, but this is just to give you an idea that people are used to the fact that agriculture is involved now with wildlife species. The sections of the Act that are applicable, it's a bit small, but the important thing is that you're looking at section 7 to 10, which deals with the registration of reproduction operators, inseminators, etc. So where you did in the past have a problem with people collecting semen and exporting semen of wildlife, at least 12 species have some protection now, and there's also, we can now give guarantees on the quality of the product. If you look at sections 13 and 14, it deals more with collection and sale of genetic material. So now, if somebody wants to export an impala from a wildlife ranch, it will require an animal improvement permit as well. So there's an extra degree of control, something that could be quite useful. Sections 11, 12, and 15 deal with the breeder societies, and this is most probably the most important section, and I'll go into details with this. But it means basically, that you can establish a breed society for a listed breed. You can have breed standards, and hopefully they won't go the way of the livestock people and have fancy standards. They'll stick to the right descriptions. And you can also have registering authorities. You can provide certificates. You can provide certifications so that now when somebody does buy an animal or use an animal, they will have the guarantees that they require. 16 and 17 deals with the importation and exportation of the 12 breeds in this case, or the 12 species. Effectively, again, if you were to export animals now of these listed species, you would need an animal improvement permit. So it's an extra degree of control, it's an extra degree of guarantees, and this is the way people should look at it. Effectively, what has happened is that the 12 species have joined what we call an exclusive group that's described as landrace breeds. Those are indigenous or locally developed breeds. And these are the breeds that require animal improvement permits for exports. If I export a Holstein or something like that, it doesn't matter. But if one of these breeds is exported, you need to have that permit. And if we look here, just out of interest, your Nguni cattle, your Drakensberger, your indigenous goats, Kalahari red goats, also indigenous, your Tuli down there, your Afrikaner, your Bapedi sheep and your Zulu sheep, all landrace breeds, extra protection. Why did we do this? It was in terms of the Convention on Biodiversity to protect the sovereignty of our breeds. So the 12 breeds have now joined this club. Now the functions and responsibilities, and this is where we come more into the actual what's happening. In the livestock breeding sector, a breed society basically is the custodian of the breed. So effectively now, the breed society for impala will be the custodian of farmed impalas. In other words, they must ensure that local, and there won't be international standards, but that local standards are maintained. Excuse me. Breed societies also decide on the identification system and the recording system for the breed, and this varies from hot iron branding, tattooing, microchips, ear tags. The breed society decides on that identification systems, and then it's used in that specific breed. What is important is that once an animal has an identification number, it's its number for life. So it never changes. Owners can change, but the number never changed. So it's easy to trace, it's easy to get information. And basically the same will apply to listed game. And luckily they are still untouched, and let's hope they remain that way, because what you basically want is the healthy animal in its natural environment to be the breed standard. You don't want somebody coming along and saying, no, hang on, we need that back to be straight, or we need that rump not to slope. These animals have evolved over millennia, and they're this way for a good reason. So it's critically important that they stay this way. And that is why it's important that the breed society also uses the descriptions that are available as the breed standards, and don't try and come up with other breed standards, because that would be a disaster. The other thing that is a big advantage is that we'll hopefully move away from having just a number in an ear tag to a better identification system. In the case of wildlife, it could be microchips, but the most important thing is this has got a 2D barcoded tag. That would be the individual number. Information can be captured manually or by scanner, but the advantage is you've got identification information, you've got the full veterinary history of that animal, you've got the full history of the animal as far as the owner is concerned, and then if you're going into the question of meat as well, you would have full value chain traceability. So from a simple identification tag on the animal, you will be able to have full information. And if somebody wants that information, that would include genetic information, which would have to be generated and put onto the system. Now, the breeding societies also, the next step would be a registering authority. And so the actual, let me get back to that one. The actual registration of the animal is done by the registering authority, and that is also empowered through the Act, and a registering authority has been established for the 12 species, and this registering authority basically provides the necessary assurances on genetic information, DNA, pedigrees, etc., so that it's all infallible, and the genetic information comes from accredited genetic laboratories. The registering authority at the moment, the only one, will be the Wildlife Producers Association, and others could be established later when they register more breeds, but they have, this is the only legal registering authority at the moment, and they have basically decided to use the NZSG, the National Zoological Garden, as their service provider for all their genetic information and tests. So I thought it's important to give you some of the reasons why they did this. And a lot of you are familiar with the NZSG, but I think the important thing is that you've got a massive backup when you use a good service provider. If you look at the NZSG is a member of Species 360. which comprises of 958 zoos and aquaria from over 90 countries. They've got global database and zoo information management system. And if you look at the amount of animal records, the wildlife medical records, which is going to become extremely important when you provide certification and people want information on that as well. They've got 167 million wildlife husbandry records. Questions are asked about this as well. They've got physiological references on the species, and they've got species-specific anesthetic and other drug regimes. Remember, all these animals are different. And they also have, and I think this is very important, is their biomaterial bank, their biobank, which has got a lot of unique records. So, in other words, by using this service provider, the registering authority will be able to provide the necessary guarantees. If we look at what they want out of their service and what they're going to get, is that they're going to get evidence-based sampling, biomaterial banking. In other words, there will be a biobank. They're getting screening of validated genetic markers. They're getting a link to the profile of stud books. In other words, you're linking the genetic information with the pedigrees, and then they're getting policy support as well. If we look at what the NZSG is doing at the moment, important here, you can see the genetic inbreeding and genetic variation, gender determination, hybridization, and this is going to become very important, parentage, genome surveys. So you've got a lot of services. When you need to provide the guarantees, this is the kind of service provider you need to use. And I'm not doing a publicity stunt for the NZSG. I'm just giving you a reason why they chose this service provider. You can see some of the publications already which have relevance to the species. So you've got an organization with a lot of backup. It doesn't mean that each registering authority has to use the NZSG exclusively, but I think this was a very good decision. Other registering authorities, while species aren't listed, other registering authorities such as SA Stud Book and Wildlife Stud Services continue to provide services in lieu of listing and registration. But you must remember that these currently have no legal standing. In other words, they can still, because the animals aren't listed, the breeds that they're dealing with, they can provide pedigree certificates, they can provide other genetic information, but it does not have any relevance in terms of the animal improvement legislation. Private labs also provide services, and it will be up to the breeders, breed societies and registering authorities to decide on what to use. But it's important to ensure that whatever you use, the information is sourced from an accredited service provider. Just to give you an idea, this is a pedigree certificate from one of the organizations at the moment. Again, this pedigree certificate, they can generate these certificates because the stable hadn't been declared a breed, but it has no legal binding to the Animal Improvement Act. And the same with some of the work done by another laboratory looking at a diversity index when you're breeding buffalo. Very useful at the moment because they're heavily inbred populations of buffalo, both in the Kruger Park, for example, and other areas. This is a service that can be provided. Again, this is not one of the listed breeds, so this has no standing as far as the other things are concerned. I know people are worried about color variance, and I think it's important just to mention this, that genetic testing information will ensure that any animal carrying a deviant genes is identified to ensure that such animals, or so-called splits, are never introduced into wildlife populations in conservancies. And this will also enable breeders with hunting operations to provide guarantees of purity for clients who have no interest in hunting a black impala or a black springbok or something. And there was an article in last week's Landbou Weekblad about concerns about hunters who are now going to Namibia because they don't want to hunt something, they don't want to hunt a black impala or whatever. So, but I'm personally not too concerned about this, because if trends in animal breeding sector are anything to go by, interest in these colour variants will decrease over the next few years, and it will stabilise with a few enthusiasts selling to each other. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. The challenge is to monitor and manage this, colour variants to ensure that there's no gene flow into wild populations, and this is where this legislation can help. Another issue, these aren't full albinos, but they've got white claws. So some colour variants could have welfare issues. If you breed an animal that's got a genetic defect, such as albinism, it gets badly sunburned, you've been cruel to that animal. And this is where genetic markers for recessive genes could provide additional guarantees, and we can stop breeding animals that have heritable genetic defects that are actually affecting their quality of life. With assisted reproductive technology, you will now, with 12 listed breeds, only registered operators will be able to collect genetic material. All transactions involving the genetic material will have to have a written warranty, and donor animals will have to be registered, and therefore you'd have certification that they're free of listed genetic defects, and they will also have to have as much information as possible, and this is where your good supplier comes in as well, your service provider. You need to have good genetic information for the person that's going to buy the genetic material. So the conservation applications, and this is where it comes to this, the introducing of new genes into inbred natural populations, either through natural mating, in other words, introducing males, or AI, where you could actually select females, synchronize and inseminate them, or even embryo transfer, where you could select recipients and you could transfer embryos into these animals. This is one of the possibilities. You've also got the whole issue of intensive breeding of critically endangered species, where you now will be able to have better genetic information on this and use it in the right way. And then the technology available will also ensure that any introductions can be screened for genetic compatibility. So if you do have a situation where you would like to introduce, say, new buffalo genetics or whatever, or let's keep it to the 12 species, you will be able to screen the wild population and the available introduction population. You'll be able to see where the best genetic relationship is, so that you do put the best possible animal into that population. Just to conclude, while questioned by some, the decision to register 12 wildlife species as animals in terms of the Animal Improvement Act should be seen as a step in the right direction as far as the more effective management of farm wildlife resources is concerned. The additional information and services generated in the process can make a meaningful contribution to conservation and biodiversity through intensive breeding of critically endangered species and the reintroduction of less related animals into endangered populations of wildlife species in conservancies. It will also provide accredited guarantees on purity for those wishing to breed or even hunt the listed species, thereby adding to the credibility and the value of farm wildlife in the sector. So please don't see the 12 listed species as a threat to conservation. It isn't. It's actually a very, very, very useful step, and it can help conservation. It adds a few teeth to your law enforcement as well. Thank you. Ndialivua.